Hello, friends. I'm so excited to share this episode with you. One of my very favorite types of episodes to record, where I get to connect with a researcher who's worked on pole dance and they can share their findings with you. And this was such a good discussion. We really dug into a lot of things. And I think a lot of the stuff in here is going to resonate with a lot of your experiences. So definitely stay tuned, but really quickly, can borrow your ear for just a second before we get into it, because speaking of evidence, I have been doing some surveys. I've been talking to a lot of folks, trying to figure out how I can help people get more consistent in their home pole practice. You've heard me say it before. You'll hear me say it again. You'll hear it from other fitness professionals. You'll hear it from exercise scientists. If you would like to achieve your goals, you need to show up consistently. And one thing that I heard a lot was that my full membership, Science of Slink, which at this point is 6 classes a week, if you do them all, is too much. And people wanted a smaller, more lightweight option. And it is coming up. So the new membership is Essentials of Slink. It is just going to be 1 hour a week. You can come to the class live. You can come recorded. I'll have 2 time track. One will be evening US time, and the other will be during the day US time / evening European time. And it'll be a little bit more affordable, less of a time commitment, a little bit more bite-sized, very easy for you to show up consistently. You will get the links to join live, you'll get reminders, you'll get the emails with the recordings. All of it's just going to happen automatically, making it as frictionless as possible for you to have a structured, complete home pole practice that includes conditioning and fun and freestyle and community. So if you're interested in learning more and you would like to lock in an exclusive discount for life, you should join the waitlist, which is in the description. And I'm not gonna talk your ear off. We're gonna get into this discussion with Nadia Ahadi, which was fantastic, and I can't wait to hear y'all's thoughts on this. So definitely, once you're done listening, drop a comment. Let me know, have you run into some of the things that the pole dancers in Nadia's research ran into as well? Interested to hear. All right, and I'll let you get into the episode. Welcome to Science of Slink, the evidence-based pole podcast, with me, your host, Dr. Rosy Boa of Slink Through Strength, and a very special guest today, Nadia Ahadi, who is a pole dancer and researcher who just published a qualitative study of body image among competitive women pole dancers in Psychology of Sports Exercise. I ran across it. I was like, we got to get one of these authors on here to talk about it. And Nadia very kindly agreed to join me. So Nadia, do you want to start off just telling us a little bit about your research background, why you're interested in this, and also, I know you're a pole dancer, so like a little bit about your pole background as well.
Thank you so much for having me, Rosie. I'm a big fan of your work. I think what you're doing is really cool. A little bit about my pole background, which I'll start off with, is that I started pole at the end of 2020, so it's like during smackdown middle of the pandemic. I would say that it was such an interesting experience because, we had to train with our masks on, yet we didn't really have a lot of clothes on, which is wild. But I think, also reflecting on my family background, which is quite conservative, I initially thought I would feel a lot of shame around it. However, I started with my sister as well, and I think that helped just sharing our thoughts around recreational pole. We've both found that it was very empowering, and we both felt like it's such a good space to explore your body and be confident in it and be accepting of what it is. And I think before I started pole, I still wasn't competitive, but I was only in the beginner levels of it. That was such a stark contrast from pole, because that was a whole environment of pressure and a lot of comparisons with other athletes. It's very different from pole. And I think that was what inspired me to explore the research about pole and competitive pole dance specifically. I just graduated from my honors year last year, so I'm very, very new to research, but it was a very refreshing experience. And considering that pole dance and the field of body image specifically it's still under-researched. And I think that a lot of the evidence on pole dance is based on recreational engagement, and we don't have enough studies exploring women's experiences in competition specifically. So I guess that's why I'm passionate about it.
Yeah, one thing that you brought up that I think it's important just to know, you were only looking at women, and also you were looking at competitive dancers in Australia specifically. I don't think
Yes.
I mentioned this. You do this work at the University of Melbourne. So do you want to talk a little bit about the competition scene in Australia? Because I know it's certainly from the US, it's fairly different. And I think for folks who are not super familiar with it, it would probably be helpful to go into the discussion of research with that background.
Yeah, so that's a good question because personally, I haven't actually been like participating in competition in the pole dance scene, but I have been a part of the audience for some of the competitions. And there's a lot of different like styles and genres you can do. There's like in-house competitions, like those that you do in studios, but there's also like the nation, like very more bigger scenes of competition. And, those tend to focus on, I guess, pole sport if you could consider it as a genre. But there's also more sensual styles, exotic, and I didn't really capture what specifically the women in my search have competed in, but it was definitely a whole range of that, like exotic, contemporary, yeah, the whole gist. And I've only studied in Australia for a few years, but I think I know that it's definitely become really popular these days. But that's why I also wanted to bring it into a research field because it's still not as explored in a public space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's very helpful. And the competition in Australia, would you say that it tends to be, are there a very wide range of abilities? Like, so someone who just started pole, like immediately compete, or is it a little bit more once you've achieved like a certain degree of technical vocabulary, that's when people tend to compete?
Hmm. So I think that you do get people who have just started their pole journey are competing in mostly in studio competitions. So I don't think they've really done competitions outside of that space. I think it's a really good place to start with. I think, with a whole sense of community and just like camaraderie and, being around women who do pole, I think that does help you prepare for a competition. But you do have competitions that have the title amateur, and it is a tricky label because I think if you think about amateur, they're, beginner levels, but some competitions do consider amateurs being more of the, I guess, advanced and beyond that, if that makes sense. But it's not of a professional level, if that makes sense. So it's still below a professional level. So I think, again, a lot of different terminologies in the pole world, but I think it's a very diverse range of things that you can compete in.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of like how the Olympics are amateur athletes, right? Or it's supposed to
Yeah,
be, or
exactly.
like college football here in the US, American football is like
Mhm.
amateur athletes, but they're, it's not that
They're
they are
athletes.
unskilled, that this is
Exactly.
not the primary thing that they're being paid to do, right? Like that's the
Yeah.
professional your income would come from. Technically, I am a professional, right? Because I
Exactly.
teach. I am not. Listen, I can't do an Aisha except with my elbow, right? Like I am not like a, particularly advanced technical level, I would say, just because
Yeah.
that's not where my interest lies. So I think it's really helpful to pull out the difference between like amateur and professional versus what that says about technical vocabulary and sort of expectation of physicality.
Yeah, for sure. And I think from my research itself, we do include women who have competed within the last year. It's just a bit of a control thing, but we also include women who, I guess, self-identify as being an intermediate level. And again, that is, I would say it's pretty big. You can consider yourself being a beginner slash intermediate, but you can also be a more advanced level and still consider yourself as an intermediate. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And
confusing.
even I mean, there's not a lot of there are a lot of standards, but there's not a lot of
Yes,
standardization across pole, right? Like, are
exactly.
you an intermediate dancer if you can invert? I think some people would say no, some people would say yes, right? Like, is that the bar?
Yeah.
Or is it like, are there specific movements? Is it about quality of movement? Is it about, just time spent training? Is it about range of skills you have, even if they don't have like as high of physicality required from them? question. It's definitely hard to standardize
Right.
for. And as a movement discipline, especially if you compare to something like gymnastics, which is extremely codified internationally,
Yeah.
it's much more challenging to compare apples to apples. So I appreciate the
Yeah.
research challenge there.
Gotta be transparent, right?
Yeah, yeah, and but part of research, right, is that as well, talking about like what you did with as much specificity as possible.
Exactly.
Speaking of, let's dive into this study a little bit. So it's a qualitative study, which means the data is not numerical in nature, just for anyone who needs that reminder.
Yeah.
And I think as someone with the social sciences background, I think a lot of times qualitative studies can get a bad rap as being like, oh, it's easier. Anyone who's done substantial work with qualitative data knows that that is in fact not the case. If you can
Mhm.
count things and stick them into your statistical models, that actually tends to be a much simpler process.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk a little bit about the research methodologies you used and how you collected this data?
Yeah. So again, I do agree that qualitative studies do get kind of a bad rep. So I do think because this is such a niche population in the field of research, it is important, first of all, to just get a better understanding of the processes and experiences that women go through in the competitive pole space. And obviously, being under research, I think that's a good point to start with. And I did use, I know there's a lot of different analysis frameworks of qualitative work out there, but what our research focused on was reflexive thematic analysis, which is basically integrating, as a researcher, your subjectivity and I guess your biases about a certain topic, but obviously the right amount and not, getting too influenced with the data, if that makes sense. But yeah, using your subjectivity to integrate yourself with the data and, the interviews. I've used semi-structured interviews and just to see where some experiences can flow with one another and, make sense as themes. So towards the end of the results, we do generate themes out of the interviews. And that's the way we present our data. And this framework I used was contextualism. I'm getting a bit jargony with this, but it essentially just means that, you know, with with everything, some truth of whatever it is exists out there, but because, we're experiencing things from different contexts, we have to acknowledge that context influence how we understand the world and make meaning out of it. So I think that's really relevant in pole because it's a very contextualized space and it's very specific. So I guess in that sense, we have to understand which experiences are unique from a population and which are consistent amongst people's experiences and things like that. But yeah, I think after the interview stage, you do code data. It's a bit different from, quantitative data, but you do have to structure like certain parts of the transcripts from your interviews and, highlight key points out of it and also interpret it on different levels. So, for instance, you're kind of labeling a certain phrase, you're restructuring it in a way that makes sense to your research and finding out what exactly they're trying to say, if there's, any underlying meanings out of it. So it's as someone who's new to that, it was very tricky at the start because, what else can I extract from whatever they're saying? But I think, it's very in-depth and it's a very lengthy process, but I think it should be appreciated as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So just sort of like to reiterate what you said, you're trying to pick apart the things that are specific about this population, right?
Yeah.
You're not looking for like, oh, I am a dancer and these are things that apply to all dancers. You're looking for what are the things that are specific to pole dancers who are competing. So you're trying to identify what's unique about that population. And then also you're trying to identify what's showing up over and over again. It's a theme that people are bringing up continuously.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to identify where in the discussion people bring that up and then sort of like and you can't do like a little bit of qualitative stuff, like what percentage of participants mentioned negative body image, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not necessarily all just sort of reorganizing and summarizing text, but that's sort of the main thrust is you're trying to take this series of conversations and extract the relevant information and then synthesize it in a way where you identify the things that seem to be pretty common in this population.
And I think what's important as well in that process is if a researcher is using certain theories to frame their results or just a general knowledge behind the research question. So I did use, I believe it was 3 theories, social comparison and embodiment theories. And I'm forgetting the other theory, but those are the theories that I've used throughout my research. So I think kind of integrating that into data analysis is very important as well.
That's what makes it, research is you're part of this intellectual tradition. And you mentioned embodiment theory, and embodiment is such like a nothing buzzword online in like movement spaces. So do you want to just clarify, when you say embodiment theory, specifically in this psychological research framework, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I do agree. My understanding of embodiment is how you're using your body to engage with the world and make sense out of it. And I think one of the theories I focused on is the developmental theory of embodiment, which explains 3 domains or factors that influence how you feel embodied. So one is related to physical power. So it's how are you using your physical capacity and your own body to make sense of yourself and the world. And there's also mental freedom, which is if you're engaging with things that make you feel liberated emotionally. And there's social power as well, which is are you belonging into a community that helps you support, those things like emotional liberation and empowerment? And I think those are very key themes in the field of pole dance. I think if you're looking at the research on recreational pole, you do see those 3 key themes emerging from the results. And, people feel like they're more confident with their skills and the ability to move their body. So also one thing that relates to embodiment is the word body functionality, which essentially just means using your body to feel, experience. But what the research has found is that people were more appreciative about their physical abilities rather than their physical appearance. So they're more in tune with what skills are they gonna try accomplish in the class or things like that. And I think that in itself is very empowering. And you also get a sense of camaraderie and sisterhood in the field of recreational pole. And you do see, I'll get into this later, but you do see, spoiler alert, similarities emerging from competitive pole spaces as well. I just remembered the other theory I wanted to say was objectification. And this is usually the opposite of embodiment. So, objectification just means when you're reducing yourself to an object, and often this would be a sexual object, like you're seeing yourself as a sexual tool for other people's pleasure, often heterosexual men. But there are research evidence out there that find that, if you're engaging with recreational pole, you exhibit higher levels of embodiment and lower levels of sexual objectification. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, whenever I think about objectification, there's a Margaret Atwood quote, and I'm not going to say it correctly, but it's basically like in every woman, very, very reductive view of gender, but in every woman, there is a straight man watching her, right? Like, and the idea is that when you are experiencing your body through the lens of an outside male observer who is observing you as a sexual object.
And I think also, being voyeured by someone else is what I'm reminded of when I think about objectification. It's always portrayed in media and from like films and whatever popular culture there is today, it's still really relevant. I do think that we're sort of transgressing from that practice. There are still people out there that do think and practice objectification in that sense. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I do think it is possible to do pole dance in a self-objectifying way. And speaking of sort of populations of pole dancers who have been understudied, I really think there's just not been as much work done on strippers specifically. And I know that stripping is very different place to place. It's very different in the US than it is in Europe, than it is in Australia, I'm sure. And I just want to acknowledge that even though recreational and competitive dancers may have one relationship to their bodies that pole dance brings out, someone who is engaged in sex work is probably going to have a different relationship. But also, sex workers are a special population, which I'm sure you know that, but just for the list, generally tend to be much more challenging to do research on because there's a potential that engaging in research could be harmful to those participants. So it's a much more rigorous process to attempt a project on a population like that. Which doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It requires a lot of care and time and additional effort.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also like thinking about caring for participants itself. I remember having to make sure that my participants are comfortable talking about topics like disordered eating, which is a very sensitive topic to begin with. And I'm sure that in general, competitive spaces, not only pole dance, but figure skaters or advanced elite ballet dancers, it's quite common to see that practice in those spaces. So I think we should be mindful of that as well in research. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think, not specifically talking about disordered eating, but talking about some of the things that you discussed with your participants. So let's dive into your findings. So we talked about your participants. I think you had 20, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
And you did these interviews, and then you looked at the interview data and you pulled out these themes that were common across your participants, but also seemed to be specific to the population you were looking at. What were you finding? What were some of your themes? What were the things that came up over and over again?
Yeah, so I think because it's such a lengthy result, I will just go through the themes one by one. Yeah, so first theme that popped up was about body functionality, like I said earlier. So this theme just explains women's experiences about reconciling concerns about their physique, their physical appearance, by emphasizing what their body can do as a pole dancer. So women do recognize that values like leanness and strength were very beneficial for competition in terms of just helping you maneuver into tricks easily, making things look aesthetic and more powerful, but it's not absolutely necessary. And it's more about how you can control your body and how you carry it through your routine. And I think one of the things I asked in the interview was if they think there's an ideal body for a competitive pole dancer. And I can't get into the statistics, but mostly women said that there isn't. And it's more about what you're capable of doing. And if you're just accomplishing your own goals out of the competition. And women also gained a sense of athleticism out of this. So that's what makes them feel good about their bodies rather than how they appear to other people. And within this theme, women also appraised clothing in competition in practical ways. So in a sense, they're redefining attire from an aesthetic perspective into a more functional perspective. So they're not thinking like, oh, wearing minimal clothing would make me feel exposed and I feel insecure. But it's more about setting that mindset into, oh, wearing minimal clothing helps me grip the pole better and help me become exposed to different points of contact or grip, which helps in competition if you're doing a lot of tricks. And also the topic of food is also being redefined as something functional. So some women who have histories of disordered eating were able to shift their outlook of food as being fuel for your body. So they're engaging more intuitive practices for that. But I do want to highlight that, this wasn't something I was aware of initially, but some women have to engage in functional diets. So by that I mean they're dieting not for appearance purposes, but I think one participant mentioned some foods cause them to be more sweaty, and then that would not help with the grip and your performance. So they would have to be mindful of that. And that is a risk for, becoming preoccupied with your physical appearance, because dieting culture is it's very tricky. And I think that's where we do see some concerns about appearance starting to emerge. That is the first theme. Is it okay if I go through the second, or do you have any comments? Good for thoughts.
It's like a quick sidebar. I think I mentioned this on the podcast before. One thing that will make you sweat more is caffeine. But it can also help you increase effort and output. So, I think really up to the individual. And also, I think something that really, really stuck out to me is when we're talking about functionality, what we are deciding is a high level of functionality is very cultural, right? So like the idea that being able to do very physically challenged things is what makes you a good pole dancer, that is what high functionality looks like, as opposed to thinking about maybe quality of movement, which might not require, a high degree of flexibility or strength, but would require like a great degree of body awareness and proprioception. Right? Like it's very cultural what a very functional body means and what functions we expect. We expect different things from a sumo wrestler and a rhythmic gymnast. So even if we are shifting our viewpoint, even if we do see this effect of shifting a viewpoint from, I'm talking to pole dancers here, even if we are shifting our viewpoint from like, oh, my body should look a certain way to, oh, my body should move a certain way, there's nothing inherent about this is the thing that genuinely makes a good pole dancer and is the core of it, and there's nothing changeable about it. That is going to come from your expectations of the social group, and you are always welcome to challenge that, right? Like you as a dancer get to decide what being very functional looks like. And it may not look like I'm working on the most extreme tricks. It may look like I just want to be able to move and feel good. Obviously in competition, you are being judged on specific things, and the specific things that we are choosing to judge in competition is, again, a cultural choice. There's nothing inherent about this has to be the thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, sidebar. Getting back to it.
Yeah. That also reminded me about, how people deal with the judging criteria as well. I don't think that was really much explored in my research, but I do remember some participants mentioning that, after a competition, I don't look at my score or what feedback I've gotten, because it won't help me, like I just, they've mentioned that they do just want to align themselves with their own goals and emphasize fun in competition. I know it's a serious thing to be engaged in, but it's important to kind of explore that side as well. But anyways, related to community, this is the second theme I'm going to explore, which basically highlights how women feel nurtured and also feel tensions around a sense of belonging in the competitive pole space. So there are pros and cons in this. So the pros are that women do feel it is a very supportive space for improving your body confidence, and instructors specifically were very important in inspiring that idea. So they do emphasize that it is a space that celebrates milestones related to how you move your body, regardless of what it looks like. I guess that also, in a way, inspired peers in a training space and being supportive of one another's success, even though it might be different. And as a sidebar, physical environments also shape how you feel about your body. So it was very interesting because some women prefer training in dimmed or colored lighting because it helps them just feel better about themselves and kind of distract or mute down any insecurities that they have about their body. Whereas, in a more natural lighting space, it's something that will be really exposed. But some pole dancers do find that training in a natural space with natural lighting helps them, I guess, become desensitized to, you know, body flaws that they have and just focus better on exploring different tricks that they can put into competition. And again, that emphasizes, training and competing safely, which is very important. You do see cons in this topic because you do see a lot of body comparisons happening amongst competitors. So I guess I'm going to explain what upward comparison means. So that just means you're comparing yourself with someone who you think has a better skill set than you. So often women still compare with other competitors who seem to have a more solid dancing background. So these were people who maybe have had years of dancing experience and, perform tricks more flexibly and make things flow better. So that does inspire a lot of insecurities and feeling conscious about yourself. Performing in a space that is very public, it causes a lot of distress in the sense that you're more wary of what the audience are thinking about you. Someone said that looking at facial expressions from an audience will cause them to feel a bit disconscious about their bodies. And there are also things about subtle practices that uphold this idea of traditional femininity. In our study, a lot of these women are heterosexual, and there's just a minority of women who identify as being more masculine or have a more transgressive identity. But they do find that, for instance, there's a practice of shaving your body hair for competition. And they would question their sense of belonging because of that. So I think that's also important. And the role of documentation is, I think, a really interesting finding because you get a lot of photos and videos after a competition. Women use that to reflect on their self-image and how they feel about their bodies, even affecting them in daily life. So, for instance, if someone were to experience a lot of body insecurities, outside of pole, and they reminisce on photos on their competition, and it displayed a level of success. They find that it helps them navigate those moments of, I guess, negative body image. But if you're looking at photos where your angles might be awkward or you're not pointing your toes or things like that, it evokes a lot of negative self-evaluation. And they start to question if they are, I guess, embodying a successful pole dancer in the competitive space.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, this is something I think about a lot as an instructor, but also someone who's like creating a studio space, right? Because I'm trying to be very intentional about the type of community that I create. Yeah, and a couple of things you brought up. So some of the specific things that you brought up, like a sense of observing yourself, feelings of comparison, are really like hallmarks of the opposite of being in a flow state, right? From psychology. I have a podcast on it where I go deeper into like she sends me eyes work, but really as an evaluation, even if it is evaluation of ability rather than evaluation of body shape specifically, is very far from that flow state that I think a lot of dancers enjoy being in because pleasure is one of the qualities. And then the other thing that you brought up that I think a lot about is this celebration of movement milestones and this expectation of movement milestones, right? And that like progress looks like being able to do more tricks. And I think there's probably like unavoidable survivorship bias here, right? Because someone who like has a really hard time learning pole tricks probably is not going to be competing, right? Or someone who doesn't feel like they are already successful to a certain degree isn't going to put themselves in a situation to be publicly evaluated. And also, if they, let's say, have an injury, become disabled, I think it's very common for when people have children to come back to movement afterwards, if they do come back to movement afterwards, with very different feelings in their bodies, very different abilities. On the one hand, I think it is very positive to move towards a more neutral view of body shape, right? And just be like, hey, bodies are different. My body's the way it is. Let's chill. I think that can be a very healthy place to be in your relationship with your physical state. On the other hand, if you've just sort of like swapped. And you're like, instead, I'm like, my body's chill because I can do skills X, Y, and Z. When you lose those abilities, because we will all become disabled at some point if we live long enough. That's just how bodies work. What happens to your identity then? What happens to your positive self-regard if it is completely tied to abilities, and especially if it's completely tied to abilities that are at the extreme range of like human ability that you're not going to be able to keep up, right? Like thinking about like Rainbow Marchenko, unless you were training like professional levels of contortion training every day, you're not going to be able to maintain that skill. It's not a thing that human bodies can just like bust out on the subway for most people. But it is something that I think a lot about, and that I do worry that if what a community celebrates about you is what you can do, when you can no longer do those things, which is coming for all of us.
Exactly. And I think that was one of the points I wrote for, possibility for future research to think about is, in the context of injury, if you're so focused on what you're able to do in the sport, what happens if that is taken away from you? And I guess I'm disagreeing with you, like moving from a focus on aesthetics and physical appearance and moving that to, functionality, although that may be good, I don't think it's healthy if you're using that as a source of comparison. And I just worry if, we're emphasizing that space for people who may have different levels of physical abilities. What happens, what happens there? It's a very challenging thing to think about, but I think we should consider that.
Yeah, and I think something that we can do as members of the pole dance community is make sure that we're not only extending belonging to people based on their abilities, but based on their shared interests, their shared values. I think that's a place that we all, just as movers, can start, right? If you're only celebrating a very specific type of body moving in a very specific type of way, even if the thing that you're celebrating is the way they are moving and not the body itself, unfortunately, those two things have now become inextricably linked. And I think it's important to, and also just as artists, right? Like you want to be able to experience and enjoy more things receptively so that you can experience and enjoy more things productively, right? You got to cross-pollinate.
Exactly. That's very true. And, having said that, again, you're in a space where you are able to, I guess, express your inner desires and put that in a more public sphere. And that is also my last point, actually, on the findings of my research. But it is about the feeling empowered through autonomy. So, how women felt about their bodies was largely shaped around the theme of personal agency and choice. So, the first point was that women felt empowered because they were able to take control of their appearance. And that is what is very interesting because of so many different costume guidelines and things like that. It can be difficult for some people to balance expressing themselves with the limits of those guidelines. But what women found were that they were able to express themselves to their own level of comfort. So if, obviously accounting for grip contact, for example, they still were able to find attires that either help them conceal some parts they weren't really comfortable of exposing, or if they felt like they wanted to, they could wear a more minimal attire, for example. And some women even made their costumes from scratch, which I think is a very good example of autonomy and choice. And interesting enough, that also influenced how they felt confident about their bodies in their everyday lives. So there were some women who, felt more comfortable exposing themselves in front of their partners in a bedroom setting, for example. And I guess it's that sense of turning, vulnerability into something powerful. But there's also the theme about, being empowered due to a choice of expressing your body through movement. So again, because there's a vast range of styles that you can compete in, people felt empowered in different ways. So for most, it could be, they could embody sexual confidence because they're portraying themselves more in a more sensual way. And that was also that spilled over into their everyday life. So, sometimes they were using their knowledge about sensual movement to leverage their intimate relationships with their partner and explore that more in depth. So that was interesting, but it is also good to note that not all people feel that way. So, if you identify as someone asexual, or, if there was a participant that mentioned because they were very frequently competing in more exotic genres, they felt desensitized to, the benefits of feeling empowered in that way. So they didn't really felt like that benefited them in a sexual way. But there are also people who wanted to portray other inner emotions or desires that may be repressed internally, whether it be something emotional, like in contemporary pieces, for example. They do feel empowered, but in a more general sense. And despite having moments where they're using sensual movements in the choreography, they don't necessarily feel like it's sexual. They just wanted to narrate something personal out of it, and projecting that into a public space is very empowering. And there's a lot of different layers of how you feel empowered. And I think that's what is very cool to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I was looking over there when you brought it up is I don't think it's going to show up on screen because the thing's kind of faded, but autonomy
Okay.
is one of my studio's values. And I
Nice.
think that Pole absolutely has the potential to really help build that in people. I'm really excited to see this as a major theme.
Yeah, for sure. I just think that, you know, I don't think it's explored about, the negative effects of functional comparison, but overall, I think that as long as they feel empowered in however they're portraying themselves and moving themselves with their own pace and their own style, and not, sort of morphing it into someone else's piece, or, yeah, you just sort of projecting your own personality out of it, I think is very important. And I think you can gain a lot of benefits from that. So, yeah.
I agree. I think the expression and the creativity is particularly important. And I mean, one potential difference between competitive pole dancers and recreational pole dancers is that recreational pole dancers are often learning someone else's choreography. I don't teach choreography. Autonomy is essential value of my studio. We only freestyle. It works together. But often if you're a recreational pole dancer, you'll only be learning other people's choreography. But if you're a competitive pole dancer, you're either developing your choreography or it's a choreography that is being designed for you specifically by somebody that you're working with, or a little bit of both, right? Column A, column B, which is something I have helped people with in the past with putting together competition pieces. And I think that there is a greater degree of creative self-expression in competition if that is the place where you get to choose the movements that you are portraying. And if that is something that you're not usually doing in a recreational pole class. So I can definitely see that being a draw and appeal and a benefit of the movement as well, is to be able to really like hone in on the things that you like the most, especially if that's not something that's really being made space for in your broader pole life.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, on the point of like individuality and creativity, I think pole really is a space that affords that, whether it be how you move or how you portray yourself, compared to other, I guess, competitive sports that, you have to wear a certain attire to compete. And, there's a sense of uniformity and things like that, that can have some negative effects, I guess, on how you're able to put yourself out there in competition. And, those spaces are often where you feel most objectified, especially if you're wearing something like form fitting or very tight and very minimal. But, because of the requirements for competition, you have to wear something minimal. You can't express yourself in different ways. And I think very empowering.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely note to end on. So this has been Nadia Ahadi talking about her research that is in the Psychology of Sports Exercise is the journal. So definitely check that out if you are interested. And thank you everybody for joining in and listening. And I hope you probably recognize at least some of your experiences reflected in this research and learn something and just have some more things to reflect on. And Nadia, is there anything you want to share or let people know about? I know you're on Instagram if you'd like to share your handle. People want to go give you a follow.
Yeah, sure. So it's still branding itself. So I'm just posting my own journey with pole, but you can find me on Instagram at psychology. I spell that out. So it's easier to be SYCHPOLEOGY. That I think that's correct.
That's probably close enough. You can find it.
Sure. I'll send it out to you and you can maybe put it in the description box or anything like that. Or you can also email me if you want to reach out at nadia.ahadi@outlook.com.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining, Nadia. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Rosy.